Before anything else, I need you to consider a possibility that may feel almost impossible to accept at first. What if the seasons of distance, confusion, and separation that have marked so much of your recent journey were never signs that you had been forgotten? What if they were evidence that something far more deliberate was taking place beneath the surface of your life? There are moments when a person reaches a crossroads and suddenly realizes that every challenge, every unanswered question, every period of silence was connected by an invisible thread all along. If no one has ever looked you in the eye and told you that with complete certainty, then let this be the moment when that truth finally arrives. The loneliness you have carried, the sense that people could hear your words but never fully understand what lived behind them. The recurring feeling that you were somehow moving through reality differently than those around you. None of those experiences happened by accident. They were not random detours. They were not evidence that you were flawed, misplaced, or somehow disconnected from the life you were meant to live. Something larger was arranging circumstances with extraordinary precision, shaping experiences that seemed painful in the moment, but were serving a purpose you could not yet see. And now, during these 4 days, from June 3rd through June 5th, the scattered pieces begin moving into place. What once looked like confusion starts revealing its design. What once felt unfair begins exposing its deeper meaning. This is not a partial understanding. This is the kind of realization that causes you to revisit your entire history through a completely different lens. Suddenly, those evenings when you felt isolated, those conversations where you walked away feeling unseen, those moments when you questioned whether you were somehow too intense or not enough, all begin to tell a different story. You start recognizing that every one of those experiences was preparing the ground for something that could not have emerged any other way. Space was being created, distractions were being removed, certain parts of you were being shielded until the moment arrived when they would finally be needed. And if you somehow found yourself here during these exact days, after everything you have endured, do not dismiss that timing too quickly. There are moments when life closes one chapter so quietly that we do not realize it has ended until the next chapter begins to reveal itself. This feels like one of those moments. You may believe you are simply watching another video, but there is a deeper possibility. You may actually be standing at the threshold between who you have been and who you are becoming. What follows is not intended to confirm what you already think. It is meant to challenge the explanations you have been carrying for years. It is meant to make you question whether your struggles were ever what you believed them to be. And the most important insight is not something that appears immediately. It unfolds gradually. Each realization prepares the next. Each layer of understanding opens the door to another. By the time you reach the deeper truth hidden beneath all of this, something inside you may finally shift in a way that countless previous attempts never managed to accomplish. Before we move any further, pause for a moment and reflect. If you had to summarize the last 6 months of your life using only a single word, what would that word be? Not the word you think sounds impressive, not the word you believe others would expect. The real word, the honest word. The one that appears when you stop filtering yourself and allow the truth to surface. Because the answer carries more significance than you realize. Now let us talk about the type of person who often finds themselves walking through the kind of isolation you have been experiencing. As I describe them, you may notice a strange sense of recognition, not because the description is broad enough to fit everyone, but because it touches something deeply familiar. This person moves through life with a level of sensitivity that rarely announces itself publicly. It is not dramatic. It is not attention-seeking. Most people would never even notice it, yet internally everything is felt with greater intensity. Small moments leave larger impressions. A brief interaction that disappears from someone else's mind within minutes can remain active in this person's awareness for hours. A subtle emotional shift in a room, a hidden tension inside a conversation, an atmosphere that others overlook entirely, all become immediately noticeable. It is as though their awareness naturally detects layers that most people never pause long enough to perceive. Over time, this creates a difficult challenge, because when your experience of reality consistently operates at a deeper level than the environments around you, you learn to adapt. You learn how to lower the volume of what you truly perceive. You learn how to translate your inner experience into something more acceptable, more understandable, more comfortable for the people surrounding you. You become skilled at reducing complexity into simplicity. You become an expert at taking emotions that feel enormous internally and presenting them in ways that seem manageable externally. Eventually, this process becomes so automatic that you no longer recognize it as a process at all. It simply becomes the way you exist. Yet every translation requires energy. Every act of reducing yourself to fit a smaller emotional space demands effort. Every moment spent adjusting your natural perception to match someone else's expectations quietly drains something from you. The exhausting part is not what people see. The exhausting part is the constant editing that happens beneath the surface. It happens while you speak. It happens while you listen. It happens while you decide which thoughts are safe to share and which ones are too deep, too complicated, or too difficult for others to understand. And because this pattern often begins so early in life, because it becomes woven into your identity before you fully understand what is happening, many people never consciously recognize it. They simply notice the result. They leave social situations feeling depleted. They spend time with others and wonder why they feel so tired afterward. They assume something is wrong with them, when in reality they have spent years carrying the invisible burden of translating an entire world that most people never even realize exists. What most people never understand is that the need for solitude was never something you chose. It was something your spirit quietly required in order to remain balanced. After spending time around others, you often found yourself craving silence without fully knowing why. You simply knew that being alone helped you return to yourself. Somewhere along the way, you began noticing that there were almost two distinct versions of who you were. One version appeared when you were surrounded by people, adapting, responding, fitting into the emotional rhythm of the environment. The other emerged only in private when the noise faded and you no longer had to adjust your inner world for anyone else's comfort. And deep down, you knew those two versions were not identical. That realization may have confused you for years. You may have wondered whether something was wrong with you, whether your difficulty finding genuine connection meant you were somehow too complicated, too emotional, too intense, or too different from everyone else. But none of those explanations tell the real story. The season of isolation you have been living through was never proof of a social failure. It was not evidence that you lacked the ability to connect. It was the predictable outcome of possessing a depth of perception that rarely found an equal reflection in the environments around you. This is not about judging other people. It is not about claiming superiority or suggesting that those around you lacked value. Every person develops according to their own path, their own experiences, and their own level of awareness. The challenge arose because the depth from which you were experiencing life often did not match the depth from which others were engaging with it. When those levels fail to meet, loneliness is created, not because people are absent, but because true resonance is absent. And there is a particular kind of loneliness that emerges from that mismatch. It is the loneliness of sitting in a room filled with people while feeling completely unseen. It is the loneliness of speaking while realizing nobody is hearing the part of the message that matters most. It is the loneliness of sensing entire emotional landscapes beneath the surface of an interaction while everyone else remains focused only on what is visible. That feeling has been real. The disappointment has been real. The longing has been real. The grief attached to it has been real. They were relationships that almost became what you hoped they would become. Connections that appeared promising at first, only to stop just short of the depth your heart was searching for. There were conversations where you reached outward, hoping to be met fully, only to discover that the bridge extended from your side alone. Over time, you learned to shorten your reach. You learned to lower expectations. You learned to settle for smaller exchanges because they felt safer than experiencing another disappointment. Yet every time you settled, a quieter part of you mourned what you truly desired. That private grief followed you longer than most people ever realized. And yet, despite how painful those experiences were, they served another purpose at the same time. I understand that statement can sound like a comforting cliché. People often use words like preparation when they want to soften suffering or make hardship seem meaningful after the fact. But what I am describing is something far more practical than that. There is a pattern that appears repeatedly in human growth, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. When someone is approaching a major transition in life, a transition requiring abilities they have not fully developed yet. Circumstances often begin removing the very things they once depended on. What looks like loss is frequently training. What feels like deprivation is often refinement. The external supports that once provided certainty begin disappearing. The approval that once offered reassurance becomes inconsistent. The validation that once confirmed your value stops arriving in the way it used to. Suddenly, the familiar feedback loops no longer function, and the person going through this transformation finds themselves standing in unfamiliar territory with fewer distractions, fewer reassurances, and fewer voices telling them who they are supposed to be. At first, this can feel deeply unsettling. Human beings naturally seek confirmation from the world around them. We want signs that we are moving in the right direction. We want evidence that our efforts matter. We want other people to recognize our worth. But when those external mirrors become unavailable, something extraordinary begins to happen. The attention that once flowed outward is forced inward. The noise diminishes. A constant stream of opinions, reactions, and expectations loses its influence. What remains is the quiet voice that has always existed beneath all of it. And during isolation, that voice becomes impossible to ignore. This is why the preparation period feels so intense. You are no longer able to escape yourself. You become intimately familiar with your own thoughts, your own fears, your own intuition, your own truth. The process is rarely comfortable. In many cases, it feels like wandering through darkness without a map. Yet beneath that discomfort, a foundation is being built. The loneliness you experienced was only the visible surface. Underneath it, an entirely different construction project was taking place. Layer by layer, experience by experience, an inner structure was forming. A stronger relationship with yourself, a deeper understanding of your own motivations, a more refined awareness of your strengths and weaknesses. Most importantly, a growing ability to recognize truth without needing someone else to confirm it first. This is the hidden gift that emerges from prolonged isolation. People who spend years relying on external approval often develop identities shaped by the expectations surrounding them. But those who endure periods of deep solitude are forced to discover something different. They learn who they are when nobody is applauding. They learn what they believe when nobody agrees. They learn what feels true when no external authority validates it. And that kind of self-knowledge possesses a different quality altogether. It is not borrowed. It is not inherited. It is earned. Through countless moments of uncertainty, you were gradually developing the ability to trust your own perception. You were learning to stand firmly in what you sensed, even when the environment around you reflected something entirely different. You were learning to recognize inner truth without requiring external permission. And although it may not have felt like growth at the time, that capacity is precisely what the next chapter of your life will demand. The strength you forged during those silent seasons, the ability to trust what you know even when nobody else reflected it back to you, is precisely the gift these 4 days are beginning to uncover. This is where the hidden purpose starts revealing itself. This is where pieces that once seemed disconnected begin forming a pattern that can no longer be ignored. And if you have been part of this journey for any meaningful amount of time, then you already know something important about what we explore together here. We are not interested in surface explanations. We are not interested in quick answers designed to create temporary comfort. The deeper realities of spiritual transformation demand a level of honesty and exploration that most conversations never reach. That is why the work we do here consistently moves beneath appearances and into the mechanisms operating underneath them. Not because being different has value on its own, but because genuine understanding requires depth. If you have not yet committed yourself fully to this path, then I invite you to consider why. The information available to you here is not simply another collection of spiritual observations. It is an ongoing exploration of the unseen patterns that shape human growth, emotional evolution, and the mysterious timing through which life unfolds. We examine lunar cycles, inner awakenings, periods of uncertainty, and moments of breakthrough in a way that connects them into a larger narrative. And what is approaching over the next 30 days will continue building on everything that has already been unfolding. Every insight, every realization, every conversation is becoming part of something larger than any single message could communicate alone. Think of it as assembling a mosaic, One piece by itself may appear interesting, but only when enough pieces are placed together does the full image emerge. The weeks ahead are carrying revelations that will challenge how you interpret every spiritual phase you have experienced recently. The isolation, the confusion, the delays, the waiting, the preparation. All of it is about to be viewed through a different lens. That is why remaining present matters. Spiritual development is not a collection of isolated moments. It is a continuous process of understanding, and every stage prepares the next. Now, with that foundation established, we need to talk about why the period from June 3rd through June 5th is unlike any other energetic window appearing this year. To understand the significance of what is opening now, you first have to recognize what has just come to an end. The blue moon of May 31st marked the completion of a much larger process than many people realize. This was not simply another lunar event passing through the calendar. It represented the closing of an entire chapter that has been developing throughout the first half of the year. A chapter centered around inner preparation, emotional refinement, clearing outdated patterns and bringing hidden truths into awareness. Everything that felt delayed, everything that seemed frozen, every moment when it appeared as though life was moving around you while you remained in the same place, every experience that made you question whether progress was actually happening. Those were not signs that nothing was occurring. They were signs that an invisible stage of development was reaching completion. Growth is not always dramatic. Sometimes the most important transformations happen in silence, beneath the surface, where nobody can see them. The months behind you have been devoted to that quieter kind of work, necessary work, uncelebrated work, the kind of work that rarely receives recognition while it is happening because its results cannot be measured immediately. But now, something changes. The clearing process that occupied so much of your energy has reached its conclusion. The foundation has been laid, the preparation has served its purpose, and the period stretching from June 3rd through June 5th becomes the first opening into what comes next. This is not the most explosive window waiting for you this month. More powerful, energetic developments will arrive later in June. Greater intensity is coming. Larger shifts are approaching. Yet despite that, these 4 days may ultimately prove more important than any of them. Because before movement can occur, understanding must arrive. Before a new chapter can be lived, it must first be recognized. This period functions as a threshold between two realities. One reality is ending, another is beginning, and the bridge connecting them is made of awareness. During these days, something remarkable becomes available. You gain the opportunity to understand the deeper purpose behind everything that came before. Situations that once appeared unfair begin revealing their hidden function. Experiences that felt like deprivation begin exposing the development they were creating. Delays that felt frustrating begin showing themselves as protection. What once seemed like being left behind begins looking very different when viewed through the lens of timing. Sometimes life does not accelerate because acceleration would be harmful. Sometimes progress is postponed because the version of you arriving at the destination is still under construction. And when that realization arrives, the entire emotional meaning of your past can shift in an instant. That is why this bridge matters so much. The way you cross it determines the quality of the cycle that follows. Not because you must take immediate action, not because you must make dramatic decisions. In fact, this window is not primarily about action at all. It is about illumination. It is about seeing clearly. The energy available here is clarity energy. It is the kind of energy that shines light into places that were previously hidden. It does not push you forward. It helps you understand where you have been. It reveals the terrain before asking you to walk it. And the specific clarity being offered is not focused on what happens next. Most people are always asking what comes next. They want predictions. They want outcomes. They want certainty about the future, but the gift available during these days is far more valuable. It is clarity about why. Why the isolation happened, why the misunderstandings occurred, why certain connections never fully developed, why specific challenges appeared exactly when they did, why the difficult season lasted as long as it did, why the preparation unfolded in the way it unfolded. These are the questions being illuminated now, and the answers have the power to change your relationship with your entire past. Unfortunately, Many people will move through this window without recognizing its significance. They will treat these days like any other days. They will stand on the bridge without realizing they are standing on it. The opportunity for insight will appear, and they will unconsciously turn away from it. Not because the clarity is unavailable, but because clarity demands honesty. And honesty requires something many people resist. It requires the willingness to reconsider the story you have been telling yourself about your own life. It requires the courage to question whether what looked like rejection was actually redirection, whether what looked like punishment was actually preparation, whether what looked like abandonment was actually protection. And that realization, uncomfortable as it may initially feel, is exactly where the next stage of understanding begins to unfold. The difference between you and most people moving through these days is that you are no longer walking through this moment unconsciously. You recognize that something important is unfolding beneath the surface, and that awareness changes the way every experience is interpreted. It changes what you notice. It changes what you question. It changes what you are willing to learn from events that others dismiss as ordinary. That is why I want you to pause for a moment and reflect on something deeply personal. Complete this sentence for yourself. The moment I felt most misunderstood was when. You do not need to reveal the entire story. You do not need to explain every detail. Just allow yourself to acknowledge the beginning of it. Give it a name. Give it a place in your awareness, because experiences that remain unnamed often continue influencing us from the shadows. The simple act of recognizing them begins changing their power over us. And now we need to talk about what prolonged misunderstanding actually creates inside a person, not as a diagnosis, not as a label, but as a collection of internal patterns that quietly form over years of feeling unseen, patterns that eventually become so familiar that they seem like part of your personality when they are actually adaptations. Invisible strategies developed in response to repeatedly having your reality questioned, overlooked, or dismissed. These strategies do not disappear simply because the circumstances that created them are gone. They continue operating beneath the surface, influencing choices, shaping relationships, and affecting the way you interpret the world long after their origin has been forgotten. The first pattern often begins with self-doubt, not dramatic self-doubt, but subtle self-doubt, the kind that slips quietly into everyday moments. Imagine sensing that something is wrong in a situation. You feel tension beneath someone's words. You notice an emotional shift nobody else appears to recognize. Your intuition alerts you to something hidden beneath the obvious narrative. Yet when you express what you perceive, the response is dismissal. You are told you are overthinking. You are told you are imagining things. You are told you are reading too deeply into something simple. At first, these moments seem insignificant, but repeated enough times, they begin leaving an imprint. Eventually, a difficult question starts forming inside your mind. Am I seeing something real, or am I creating meaning where none exists? And that question becomes the beginning of a larger struggle. Because when your inner experience consistently conflicts with the opinions of those around you, it becomes tempting to assume that the majority must be correct. Not because they necessarily are, but because agreement carries a certain authority. The collective voice sounds convincing. The repeated contradiction becomes persuasive. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, you begin trusting external interpretations more than your own direct perception. This is one of the most damaging consequences of extended misunderstanding, not because it destroys confidence all at once, but because it weakens it gradually. It rarely arrives as a dramatic collapse of self-trust. Instead, it appears as hesitation. It appears as that extra moment before speaking. It appears as mentally rehearsing your words before sharing them. It appears as questioning whether your insight is valid enough to be voiced. It appears as editing yourself before anyone else has the chance to. Over time, a gap forms between what you genuinely perceive and what you actually communicate. The deeper truth remains inside, while a safer, more socially acceptable version is presented to the world. You learn how to package your knowing in ways that create less resistance. You learn how to dilute certainty into possibility. You learn how to make powerful insights sound smaller than they are. And eventually, this becomes automatic. The second pattern is even more painful because many people do not recognize it for what it is. It creates a loneliness that cannot be solved simply by spending more time around others. Most people assume loneliness comes from physical isolation. They assume the answer is more conversations, more gatherings, more interaction. But there is another kind of loneliness that exists beneath all of that. It is the loneliness of being surrounded by people while still feeling unseen, the loneliness of participating without truly connecting, the loneliness of being acknowledged externally while remaining invisible internally. You can spend an entire day talking to people and still return home carrying the same emptiness. Not because nothing happened, but because the part of you that needed to be understood never entered the conversation. The deeper layer remained hidden. The real perception remained unshared. The authentic experience remained untouched. And after enough experiences like that, something begins changing. You stop offering the deeper layer altogether. You learn to participate only at the depth the environment can accommodate. You bring the version of yourself that fits. The rest stays private. The rest stays protected. The rest remains locked away where it cannot be misunderstood again. From the outside, everything appears normal. Yet internally, the separation grows, and that separation is what true loneliness feels like. It is not the absence of people, it is the absence of meaningful recognition. It is the distance between who you are and what others are able to receive. The third pattern may be the most difficult of all because it strikes at the heart of your identity. After years of feeling different, after years of sensing more than others seem to notice, after years of longing for a level of connection that rarely appears, many people begin asking a dangerous question. What if the depth itself is the problem? What if life would be easier if I felt less? What if I would belong more easily if I noticed less? What if I could finally experience the connection I want if I stopped looking beyond the surface? The question often arrives quietly. Sometimes it appears during periods of exhaustion. Sometimes it emerges after another disappointing interaction. Sometimes it shows up during moments when you are tired of carrying an awareness that seems to create more challenges than rewards. You begin wondering whether your sensitivity is a gift or a burden, whether your perception is helping you or isolating you, whether your desire for authenticity is wisdom or simply an obstacle to happiness. You imagine what life might feel like if you could settle for less depth, less meaning, less emotional complexity. Perhaps everything would become easier. Perhaps relationships would feel simpler. Perhaps belonging would require less effort. These doubts have accompanied many people through long seasons of isolation. They have lingered beside them during difficult nights and unanswered questions. They have followed them through experiences that seem to confirm their fears. And if that doubt has been living beside you for longer than you care to admit, then what comes next matters more than you realize. Because this particular question deserves more than reassurance. It deserves a direct answer. It deserves clarity. And the truth hidden behind that doubt is exactly where the next stage of this journey begins to reveal itself.